Good morning, everybody. Fantastic to be here and to see so many people logged into this session. My name is Richard Harral. I'm the CABE Chief Executive, and today we're going to be looking at the CABE Professional Code of Conduct. The session will involve an introduction and overview. We'll talk a bit about what is a code of conduct. We'll talk about some key concepts underpinning professional conduct. We'll then look more specifically at the CABE Code of Conduct itself, which comprises of two essential parts: a set of mandatory requirements, a set of standards and principles, which set out the framework against which we expect CABE members to behave and deliver their professional services. And then I'll give an overview of the CABE complaints and disciplinary system as well. By the end of this session, the aim is that you will understand how the CABE Code of Professional Conduct protects you, other people, the association and the environment. Some key concepts about professionalism. You should understand your mandatory obligations as a CABE member. You should understand the wider expectations for professional conduct in terms of CABE's expectations set out in the framework, and also the CABE complaints and disciplinary system, including the sanctions that can be applied, but also some key pointers about the most common areas where complaints against professional conduct arise. So it's really important that everyone who holds himself out as a professional understands the relevant code of conduct that applies to them, and that applies to CABE members as much as it does to anyone else. The codes of conduct are assimilations of kind of received wisdom, and they are really valuable in helping to deliver services properly. Where many of the factors covered by the code of conduct fail, it can lead to catastrophe. So the public inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire identified multiple root causes, including serious professional failings, including a lack of professional accountability, individuals and organisations working beyond the limits of their competence. We'll come back to that later. Dishonesty and misrepresentation, lack of accuracy and rigour, disregard for the welfare of others, and prioritisation of profit over safety. What we're going to do in today's session is explain how the CABE competence framework and code of conduct map together to provide guidance for all of our members on how to meet those expectations and to deliver services to the highest possible standard. So first of all, let's talk about why do we have a code of conduct, and what is a code of conduct? So CABE is accountable to the Privy Council under our Royal Charter, and within that charter we have a series of what are known as public interest objectives alongside governance frameworks and other requirements. So our kind of primary aims are to set standards, so to provide continuing professional education for and objective standards for and an independent assessment of professional competence for those practicing the art and science of building engineering, to raise awareness of professional building engineering practices for the benefit of the public and industry, and to collaborate to encourage and facilitate cooperation between the construction professions. But within that Royal Charter, we have clause 3.7, which requires that we establish a code of professional conduct for members, including mandatory continuing professional development and supported by a disciplinary procedure. So we would have this in any case, but it's absolutely hardwired into our Royal Charter. What is a code of conduct? Well, this is drawn from the 2007 Accountants Code of Practice, but it's a pretty good description of what the essence of a code of conduct. It's something that sets out the principles, values, standards, or rules of behaviour that guide the decisions, procedures, and systems of an organisation or an individual in a way that contributes to the welfare of its key stakeholders and respects the rights of all constituents affected by its operations. So this is one of the key things to understand with the Code of Conduct. It's not simply a set of club membership rules. We're not a club, we're an association, but it's a framework that is intended to ensure that we are outward looking as well as inward looking in terms of the impact of our activities. What's the purpose of the code? It has two primary purposes. Firstly, it sets expectations for CABE members to work against in their practice as building engineers. So we try to create a framework of expectations and approaches that are mapped onto professional service and behaviours. And secondly, it provides a standard against which professional conduct can be measured if we receive complaints against CABE members. The Code of Conduct itself imposes both mandatory requirements, which must be met and are quite prescriptive in nature. We'll go through this later, and principled standards, which are, if you like, the guiding light of the expected behaviours and practices for CABE members. The code is the foundation for all disciplinary investigations, and failure to comply with the code can result in a disciplinary sanction. We also have the CABE Guide to Ethical Professionalism, which sits alongside the code, which provides an expanded examples of good conduct, which meet the threshold set out in the Code of Professional Conduct. You don't have to comply with the guidance in the guide, but it could be material in considering any complaints through a disciplinary process. So it's important that you are familiar with both of those documents. How does the Code of Conduct relate to the law? The code does not in itself ensure legal compliance, and compliance with the law does not ensure compliance with the code. So quite often we have discussions with members who argue that because they followed the law, they've also, by default, met the requirements of the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct goes beyond legal requirements. It sets other expectations which also need to be met. Legal compliance can sometimes be unfair. You may comply with the law, but behave in a way that's unfair to others. And just because something is legally compliant, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily right, or that complying with the law is sufficient to meet the requirements of the code. So the code will often require you to do more than the legal minimum. And it's important that you understand that. Clearly, legal compliance should be achieved universally. We should have no doubt about that. That is an absolute minimum. But just because you've complied with the law doesn't mean you've necessarily met the expectations of the code. That's important because construction is a really challenging industry to work within. It's a brilliant industry, but it's absolutely driven by high pressure, by cost, by timescales that inevitably create professional and ethical issues that you will have to confront in your day-to-day work. Key to our members' understanding, though, is that regardless of all other concerns, you must prioritise public safety. Even if that risks putting you in breach of other contractual or legal duties, acting in the public interest to protect the public does provide a degree of protection. But we should not assume, it's absolutely critical we don't assume that the law overrides our duty to protect others. Before we go to look at the specifics of the code, I want to kind of briefly discuss some of the kind of key concepts that professionals need to understand. These are things that we all need to be aware of and have a shared understanding of as members of the association. So the first question that comes up here is what do we actually mean by professional? The understanding of and use of the term professional has changed radically over time. There are two definitions here from different sources. Elliot Friedson was an academic who spent his entire career looking at professional bodies and professional behaviours, and he stated that professionals demonstrate an ideology that asserts greater commitment to doing good work than to economic gain, and to the quality rather than the economic efficiency of work. Now, he's talking about this key concept of there being a conscious balance between the need to be economically active, profitable, make a living, and responsibilities to society and the wider environment. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But a more recent definition from Wikipedia states that a professional is a member of a profession or any person who works in a specified professional activity. Our view at CABE is that that is not an adequate definition of what it means to be a professional. The mindset required to deliver professional activities responsibility, particularly in the built environment, goes much further than just actually undertaking a job or role. One alternative way of understanding Friedson's view is to consider the public interest. Now, the public interest is something that you'll hear discussed very widely and commonly when people start talking about ethics. But essentially, the public interest recognizes the tension between commercial interests, i.e. business activities, and the practice of a profession, and the interests of wider society. The key here is that we are all, as professionals, expected to consciously balance those wider impacts and be conscious of them when we're advising or making decisions that affect our clients or the built environment as a whole. It's generally recognized that for individuals, it can often be very challenging to apply a public interest balance in the work we do. We are constrained by procurement mechanisms, by contractual arrangements, by all sorts of commercial and other impediments that mean that it can often be tricky to work out how to know if you're acting in the public interest. But in practice, professional bodies have spent a long time through history evolving frameworks that help us to understand what it actually means to act in the public interest. And it's not just about the day-to-day decisions, it's about a general professional way of living. And that's kind of enshrined in the CABE competence frameworks and code of conduct and other supporting documentation. Combined together, those documents and the way that we ask you to conduct yourself as a member of the association set out standards of competence, behaviours and ethical expectations that allow you to deliver against the public interest over time. Now, where is this to be found, you may ask? Well, one good place to start to understand how this professional framework hangs together is in Section E of the CABE competence framework. CABE competence framework is based on and drawn from a great deal of learning driven by the Engineering Council as the regulator of engineers in the UK. And Section E of the competence framework has 5 elements under this section titled Professional Commitment and Standards. Those requirements are to comply with the Code of Conduct, manage and apply safe systems of work, understand the principles of sustainability, manage your competence and carry out and record suitable CPD, and to act ethically. Now, as a starting point and as a fundamental basis for professional behaviours, these 5 criteria are a really great place to begin. Whilst technical and managerial skills remain critical, it's genuine commitment to these values and behaviours that really set professionals and particularly engineers apart. Alongside those requirements for professional commitment, there are wider societal expectations that we expect our members to understand. We will do more work over the coming months and years to look into some of these specific duties and to expand on them. But we all have a general duty of care. Clients and third parties rely on construction professionals to execute their projects safely and competently. It's vital that we always remember that in most circumstances where we're providing advice or overseeing the delivery of work, we are the experts in the room. We are the ones that others are reliant upon to deliver safe and effective outcomes. Breaching your duty to act safely and competently can lead to legal disputes, financial losses, reputational damage, which highlights the critical importance of understanding and upholding duty of care obligations. There are a whole range of duties that we need to be aware of. There are statutory duties, so that's about legal compliance under acts like the Defective Premises Act and building regulations. There are common law duties arising from case law and judicial decisions, but they broadly require professionals to act reasonably and prudently to avoid causing harm to others. Worth stressing that it's about avoiding causing harm to others. That could be financially, it could be in terms of actual physical safety. There's a very broad expectation there. We all have contractual duties. Most of us are appointed in some form under contract, which includes specific performance standards, timelines, quality requirements, and often privacy or other restrictions that we have to be aware of. And there are tortious duties. Again, that require professionals to take reasonable care to avoid causing harm to anyone who might be affected by their actions. And those duties form under the realm of negligence. So these are always applicable in the background. They're not maybe explicit in the code of conduct, but they should be things that professionals are aware of. Key to every part of a professional's working life should be an understanding of the importance of working within limits of competence. If there's one characteristic that sets professionals apart from non-professionals, it's that they are aware of what they are capable of doing, and they do not hold themselves out to be able to do things for which they are not competent. This is probably the most important concept for all building engineers. Working within the limits of your competence and knowing when to say no is the most important professional characteristic that we can establish. That includes technical competence, ensuring you have the skills, knowledge, and experience to undertake the work consistently to meet the standards required. Understanding when you've reached the limits of your competence, raising concerns or seeking more expert advice when that happens. Managing your competence, so committing to high quality, lifelong learning, CPD, and development, particularly where you're looking to do new work, is absolutely fundamental to professional standards, and understanding ethical considerations relevant to your work to make better decisions that help balance competing interests. Behaving in a way which is consistently balanced between those commercial elements. This is really, it's impossible to overstress the importance of embedding these values in your professional work. As I said, there are 3 key documents that we use to drive this. The membership framework sets out the competence standards for each grade of membership, but it also has a series of annexes which incorporates some of the guidance that I'm going to talk about in a moment under different parts of the framework. And it directly maps across onto the Code of Professional Conduct. The code is not a particularly long document. It's about 3 pages long altogether, but that sets out the kind of fundamentals of which you should be aware. And that's supported by the Guide to Ethical Professionalism, which is intended to be a companion to the code and to set out kind of good practice standards and examples that elaborate on kind of common circumstances. And this framework works. So I talked earlier about the root of our professional commitment standards in our competence framework being within the Engineering Council. And that approach, when you commit to that approach and when you practice through life, delivers a great deal of trust. This is the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index, which is a survey that is run every year by Ipsos Mori in the UK. And it asks people, for each of the different groups identified, would you tell me if you generally trust them to tell the truth or not? So it's the truth index. And engineers have been in the top 5 since I started looking at this in 2021, and are now in 2nd place. I think it is absolutely about the embedding of the values we've talked about, the key concepts and values, and understanding their importance when we're making critical decisions. It's those characteristics that have enabled engineers to be so trusted in a very kind of competitive commercial environment. So key takeaways from the first part of the session. You shouldn't view the CABE Code of Conduct as a bureaucratic document. It's not a philosophical document. It's a distillation of hundreds of years of experience in engineering practice with direct relevance to real-world day-to-day activities. We all have to take significant responsibility for the work we undertake. The advice we give, the decisions we make has impacts on others, and we owe them a duty of care. We need to practice in a way that respects the balance of commercial interests with wider societal outcomes, the public interest. So yes, we all have to make a living, but we should not be driven purely by those commercial interests in the decisions or advice we give. And the Code of Professional Conduct is a framework which sets out the fundamental expectations for building engineers, and you should use it to perfect your professional integrity. I'll mention this again later, but it is entirely legitimate in your daily working life to deploy the code of conduct as a shield against people challenging you to undertake unethical behaviors or to do the wrong thing. When I practiced, I remember regularly making reference to my code of conduct, which as a way of helping to bolster a defense or to resist pressure. So please don't just think of the code here as a tool to set expectations or to be used in a disciplinary process. Please also think of it as a shield that you can deploy to help get the right outcomes. In terms of the CABE code itself, it's similar to many other codes of conduct and is based again in guidance that's issued by the Engineering Council. It only has 3 pages of text, so it's not a long read. You're not expected to memorize the code, but you should be sufficiently familiar with it to know when you are getting close to the boundaries of the standards that are set or in order to apply them in practice. There are 2 parts to this, as I've said earlier: mandatory requirements, which are part of your membership contract with CABE and must be adhered to, and professional standards that are principle-based statements against which professional conduct may be measured. So the start of the code of conduct, we're going to go through it almost line by line. Basically sets out the expectations for professional behavior, as well as forming foundation for considerations by the disciplinary panel. Code should be read in conjunction with the Guide to Ethical Professionalism, which sets out non-exhaustive set of common matters building engineers should consider. If any disciplinary proceedings are considered, any breach of the code must be material, which is to say it must be relevant to one or more of the mandatory or professional standards, mandatory requirements of professional standards. And whilst consideration may be given to the Guide to Ethical Professionalism, failure to follow that guidance does not automatically indicate a breach of the code. Critically, paragraph 5 here, where there is any conflict between any relevant and enforceable locally applicable laws and or statutory provisions and the code, members should comply with the code to the maximum extent possible, but without contravening those laws. So what are the mandatory requirements? These are things that we expect you to fulfill. The code sets out that you will undertake CPD. So it is a mandatory requirement of membership of CABE that you will carry out CPD in accordance with the guidance notes that we publish, and that you log and record that CPD and evidence on an annual basis. So the requirements are 35 hours a year of relevant CPD or 105 hours over 3 years, and you are expected to log that every year. We are progressively tightening our CPD regime and disciplinary action for those who do not comply is now underway. You should perform your duties with such professionalism and such professional standards as CABE may reasonably expect, and be mindful of the Guide to Ethical Professionalism. And you should inform CABE as soon as practical, but normally within 14 days, if a member or the business they operate has triggered any of the following criteria: being convicted of a relevant criminal offence, being subject to disciplinary sanction by another professional institute, received an adverse civil court judgment, become insolvent, or been disqualified as a company director or charity trustee. Now, these requirements are there so that the association can determine whether they're in continuing to hold that member out as a professional in good standing, we may be at risk of putting the public in jeopardy. There is not an automatic assumption that a CABE member who triggers one of these requirements has breached the code of conduct. All cases are looked at on a case-by-case basis, but we do need to understand whether there are issues that need to be addressed arising from these very significant and relatively rare circumstances. In terms of those requirements, CPD, I've talked about 35 hours a year. There's plenty of information on the CABE website. We're going to be doing a lot more to support professional development over time, including the relaunch of our event series, which will now include a series of online half-day conferences covering core areas of CPD, which will be available to members. We also have our competence management system to support members in developing effective personal development, professional development programs. And that's going to become an increasingly important part of the CPD framework over time. In terms of the professional duties and standards set out in that first part of the Code of Conduct, it effectively reflects some of the broad expectations in terms of skill, knowledge, experience, and behaviours required by a professional acting competently. Those expectations are now written into law in some jurisdictions, i.e. in England and Wales through the duty holding framework. And it comes back to the issue I mentioned before, in that professionals typically have a significant advantage in knowledge and understanding over those they are appointed to advise, and that advantage must be exercised responsibly. Professional standards, there are general expectations found in the code and common to most professional groups in one form or another, but they can kind of be listed under 6 broad headings. Honesty and integrity, so being truthful and avoiding conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is an area where we will be doing some further webinars over time, as it is a complex but very important area. Accuracy and rigor, we should all be exercising reasonable skill and care in the work we do. Accountability, so taking responsibility for decisions and actions, including the work undertaken under supervision. Legally compliant, absolutely understanding and meeting relevant legal requirements. We should be acting in a way that's ethically sound, so taking into account wider impacts and ethical issues. And we should be respectful, behaving in a manner which respects other people's views and beliefs. I would just stress this last one, respectful, to a certain degree. Very often as professionals, we find ourselves in tricky situations, quite high pressure situations, in dispute. It's really important that we do not lose control of our demeanor in those situations. No matter how difficult the conversation, we have to maintain professional standards and behave with people who sometimes are saying or doing things that are very difficult to tolerate. We still have to behave professionally and politely and respectfully in the way that we deal with them. As professionals, we are held to higher standards, and where we are dragged down to reflect the conduct of others, it puts our own professional standing at risk. So it's not easy, but it's important that we kind of hold firm and treat people always professionally and respectfully. Mandatory reporting of matters of concern. So I touched on this. We have a responsibility to the public that when we say that our members are professionals in good standing, that is the case. So mandatory reporting is there to protect the public, where a member may be acting beyond their competence or unable to act professionally, and also to protect the reputation of the association and its members in good standing. So unless we can manage unprofessional behaviour and address it directly, it puts the reputation of the whole association at risk. So we do take this tremendously seriously. Where the code refers to relevant matters, this doesn't automatically mean that you're going to be considered to be in breach, but failing to report any of those mandatory matters is likely to be considered a breach. Our sole interest is in ascertaining whether you remain competent and do not pose a risk to the public where those events happen. And we know that there are quite often mitigating factors which can and will be taken into account. So insolvency, for instance, might result from unfair payment practices of a third party or a large debt not being paid. There is not always fault. These are just realities, unfortunately, of working in the business community. But what I can say is that these matters are always treated very seriously and very fairly. So we went through this before, but effectively, you must inform us if you've been convicted of a relevant criminal offence, been subject to disciplinary sanction by another professional institute, received an adverse civil court judgment, become insolvent, or been disqualified as a company director. We move on to paragraph 6, which has definitions for relevant criminal offence, which means any offence, including a civil offence involving dishonesty of any kind, any other offence for which a court may impose a custodial sentence, whether the court imposed such a sentence or not, and where convicted, includes acceptance of a formal caution for the offence. So we're not talking about minor issues, we are talking about serious, relevant criminal offences. There's a description of insolvency there. I'm not going to go through that line by line. But clearly, if you are running a business in a way that means you are no longer able to deliver your services or meet your obligations, you should consider reporting that to us, including describing the circumstances. Disciplinary sanction means any action taken against a member constituting a rebuke, reprimand, warning, caution, direction, imposition of restrictive conditions on membership, reduction of membership grade, suspension, and/or termination of membership for another professional body. And then there's a description of what association or body means in that context. If you are disciplined by another body, we do not automatically assume that you have also breached our own code of conduct. If an investigation is launched, it will be done against the standards we set and using the processes that we have, and the outcome may be different from any finding from from an alternative body. Other requirements: cooperation with investigations. If an investigation is formally launched, you cannot resign your CABE membership. Your membership will be held open until that investigation is complete. We expect you to cooperate fully to the full extent that you are able to do so, and failing to collaborate and cooperate with a discipline investigation may in itself be a sanctionable offence. You must use the post-nominals responsibly. There are terms and conditions set out on the CABE website and in your membership packs that describe how and where you can use CABE post-nominals. And then finally, general conduct. Really, really important that we maintain those professional behaviours at all times. The key issue here is whether a member's conduct brings CABE into disrepute. And that includes not just their direct professional work, but any material they put into publications, any material that's posted on social media, any speaking engagements or public engagements where they hold out their views or are acting in a professional capacity. So we need to be mindful of those professional values on a day-to-day basis across all of our activities. Standards of conduct. Okay, so second part of the code of conduct goes into the specific standards. Now, the way that the Professional Conduct Committee uses these standards is that they use them as relatively kind of broad bases for identifying where a breach of the code of conduct occurs. So these are described often as principle-based standards. They work very well because they avoid getting too specific. But you do need to take them seriously, and they come under a series of headings. So the first heading is to act professionally at all times. Standard 1 relates to acting with due skill, care, and diligence. Standard 2 is about accepting responsibility for work that you undertake or that is carried out under your supervision. Standard 3 is to treat all persons fairly and with respect, and act at all times in a manner which does not bring CABE into disrepute. Standard 4, do not act in any matter where to do so would result in a conflict of interest or where there is a significant risk of a conflict of interest arriving. And as soon as practical, advise affected parties when any conflict does arise. Sometimes it's very difficult. These things arise in the middle of contracts, processes, projects. It's really important that you clarify that there is a conflict. And again, we will be looking further at that issue later on in our webinar series. Standard 5, observe proper duties of confidentiality owed to appropriate parties, including steps to protect data and ensure cybersecurity. I think we're all increasingly aware of just how critical that is. Ensure no data or confidential information is disclosed save with the express consent of the subject or in response to a court order for the lawful exercise of a statutory investigation power. This includes not talking about your client's projects. you have a duty to respect that confidentiality. Even if it's down the pub or over a cup of coffee, the details of your client's projects are effectively confidential unless they give you permission to discuss them more widely. Standard 6, reject bribery and all forms of corrupt behaviour. Make positive efforts to ensure others do likewise. At all times, comply with duties and obligations stipulated in the Bribery Act 2010 or any other applicable anti-corruption and bribery legislation. And Standard 7, notify CABE of any significant violation of the Association's Code of Professional Conduct by another member. That's difficult. We know that is a hard thing to do when you work with other people. But as an industry, we have to be better at identifying, raising, and talking about risk in a more transparent and open way. There are some supporting documents that can be referred to. So this is the Engineering Council Statement of Ethical Principles. This is appended to the CABE competence framework, so it's all integrated in there, as are the other documents I'm going to refer to. But that's the entire document. It's 3 pages, including the cover, but it does provide further food for thought as to what good professional values look like. The Engineering Council also produces guidance on security, which is useful. And again, it's not a long document, but key pointers that we can all learn from. In terms of acting professionally and taking into account diversity, CABE publishes its own guidance on inclusive design, which is appended to, it's an annex in the CABE competence framework. And this kind of gives you clear pointers about the fundamental behaviours and approaches to delivering a more inclusive service and built environment. The next section of the Code of Conduct looks at managing risk responsibly. So again, it's one of those key elements of the professional commitment framework. Standard 8, comply with all relevant statutory health and safety provisions to ensure their own health and safety and the safety of anyone else who may be affected by their acts and omissions. Standard 9, wherever it is within their control, eliminate health and safety risks or cause them to be eliminated, failing which reduce the risks to the lowest reasonable practical level. Standard 10, seek actively to identify risk, report and discuss risk in a responsible manner, and raise concerns with appropriate persons or organisations about danger, risk, malpractice or wrongdoing, which may cause harm to others. This is often known as whistleblowing, and it's an important concept. Again, we are starting as an industry to do this better. If you think about schemes like the CROSS scheme, confidential reporting of structural safety, which I think its name now incorporates fire safety. We are starting to get better at talking about and addressing risk, but we still have some way to go. Again, not always an easy conversation to have, but it is absolutely clear that it is better to have a difficult conversation about risk than to be looking at something that has gone wrong, which would otherwise be preventable. Standard 11, assess and manage relevant risks and communicate these appropriately. There is a real need to be very balanced in the way that we talk about risk. We do not want to cause unnecessary alarm, but where risks are evident, we need to flag and address and manage them properly. And then assess relevant liability and hold adequate liabilities and hold adequate professional indemnity and other insurances. So public protection pieces, but also for the protection of members themselves. The Engineering Council publishes guidance on whistleblowing, which is very helpful in understanding your rights and obligations. And the Engineering Council also publishes guidance on managing risk responsibly. Again, these are all integrated into the CABE competence framework as annexes. But these are kind of key pointers, and the principles that are set out are very easily applicable and can be developed through the use of a range of tools to deliver highly effective risk management frameworks. Finally, next to last, ensure competence as a building engineer. So this maintain and enhance competency, including undertaking and recording CPD, encourage others to advance their learnings and competence, undertake only professional tasks for which they are competent, and use reasonable endeavours to ensure that others over whom they may have influence do not undertake professional tasks for which they lack the necessary competence. So that's going back to that concept of limits of competence. And Standard 16 builds on that. Be entirely candid about and disclose relevant limitations of competence to those it may affect. Again, we need to be good at saying, actually, this isn't something that I'm really capable of doing. Let's find someone else who can do that for us or advise us or help us to do it in a way which is safe and effective. And finally, Standard 17, act in a way which promotes the principles of sustainability and use best endeavours to prevent avoidable adverse impact on the environment and society. And again, Engineering Council guidance, again, integrated into the CABE competence framework, sets out those kind of key principles of sustainability, of which we recommend members should be aware. It's important to take time to ensure you're familiar with the code and supporting guidance. It's not only there to hold you to account, it is there to help you make better decisions that protect you and others when you are undertaking your professional work. Now, if something does go wrong and a disciplinary complaint is received, we have a very well-developed process which enables us to assess the validity of those complaints and, if necessary, to launch a disciplinary investigation. That's overseen by the Professional Conduct Committee within CABE, and their work is firewalled from the work of the rest of the association. So as Chief Executive, I will not know if a complaint has been laid against a member unless it reaches a final appeal stage where I am asked to arbitrate on that final appeal. All disciplinary matters are treated with the highest level of confidentiality. We have a process which filters out spurious claims, so only substantial claims where there are reasonable grounds to launch an investigation are formally referred into the PCC. And in order to ensure both transparency and fairness, we have integrated lay members, i.e. members of the PCC who are not CABE members and primarily are not from within the construction industry. We've integrated lay members into this process and we have a PCC chair is a lay member, and all of the disciplinary panels are chaired by lay members. This does not disadvantage CABE members, as the remainder of the panels are made up of experienced professionals who can act to peer review their conduct and behaviours. But it does ensure that we have the ability to hold out to the public at large that our processes are fair and not unbalanced in favour of our membership, which is an accusation which is commonly made. Very important that members cooperate with the any investigation process that is launched. We know it is a very difficult thing to be complained against in a professional context. It's a very stressful matter. It's a very emotive matter. The Professional Conduct Committee and our staff here at CABE HQ will do everything they can to ensure that the process runs smoothly. But it is important that you respond and work with us to establish the facts. Just because a disciplinary investigation is launched, that does not assume that the member is liable. There is no assumption at that point as to the finding, and we work really hard to make sure that all of the possible evidence is available to come to a fair decision. The first stage is a preliminary investigation and establishes whether there's sufficient grounds for the complaint to be referred to a disciplinary panel. That does not assume liability on the part of the member. Second stage investigation will result in the member being notified and provided with the grounds of complaint, a case summary and access to any evidence submitted, and have full right to respond. We will then, once we have all of the information from both parties, review that evidence and decide whether there are grounds to proceed to a disciplinary hearing. And then the disciplinary hearing can either be a paper-based or in-person hearing, which will involve one lay member of the Professional Conduct Committee as chair, two CABE members of the Professional Conduct Committee, and expert witnesses as required. Any outcome from those hearings is then ratified by the PCC overall before the outcome is notified to the complainant and the member. The burden of proof within CABE's disciplinary procedure is a civil burden of proof. So that means the balance of probabilities. So the task for the Professional Conduct Committee is to determine whether it is more likely than not that a breach has occurred. So it's more than 50% likelihood. If a breach is identified, the PCC has a range of sanctions it can impose. It can impose the member with a formal warning or reprimand and require them to undertake further training or some other direction, which will aim to ensure the member avoids future misconduct. We can require the member to provide CABE with an undertaking in writing that they will refrain from continuing or repeating the misconduct or committing to a specific course of action to address the misconduct. They have the opportunity to suspend the member until they complete applicable training and or comply with any other measures. They have the ability to impose a reduction of a member's membership grade until they have completed applicable training and or other measures as the disciplinary panel determines. Ultimately, they have the ability to expel the member from the association. Where a sanction is imposed, it will be published. So we have a public interest obligation to make it transparent where we have sanctioned a member. There are mitigation guidelines used by the PCC so that the decision to impose a sanction or the decision to determine a breach take into account the full range of circumstances and context to ensure the decision is fair. But in order to make sure that that process is fair, these processes are not quick. So it would be normal to expect a complaint that goes through the full process to take anywhere between 6 and 9 months, and it could be longer depending on the complexity of the case. So we're coming to the end now, and I thought it'd just be useful to set out those areas where the most common mistakes are made. Many of these failings are easy to avoid, and they're not perhaps some of the more complex or extreme circumstances that you might expect, but for sure, these are the things that we see most commonly leading to complaints against members. So number one, failure to put terms of engagement in writing. Absolutely critical that when you undertake work for someone, you explain the scope of what you're going to do, you explain how and what you're going to charge, and you have all of the normal terms and conditions attached to that to resolve any disputes or variations. It is the single most common cause of complaint, and it is entirely unavoidable. A lack of professionalism in communicating with clients. Very often people use social media apps and they communicate in a way which is less than professional. It goes back to the elements I discussed earlier about maintaining professional conduct regardless of how difficult that may be. And I know it's difficult. I've been there. You only lose as a professional if you allow those standards to slip. So regardless of how difficult the circumstances or the nature of the behaviour of other parties, it's really important you maintain professional courtesy and politeness. As I say, very difficult at times, but really important. Failure to recognise limits of competence and working outside a professional scope. Very common complaints where people sometimes very well-meaningly try to resolve a problem that's beyond their competence, and it results in technical failures or damage or failure to perform, and complaints arise. So again, if in doubt, step back, be honest about the limits of what you feel you can do. Failure to effectively deal with complaints lodged with a member or their business. Something we all need to get better at is dealing with complaints. We will be looking at producing some further training on that at some stage next year. But complaints handling is a key skill, and you have to deal with it fairly and you have to deal with it politely. And if you've made a mistake, you need to make sure that you address that default in a way which helps to resolve the situation before it becomes a professional complaint matter. Failure to engage with the disciplinary process or cooperate with the professional conduct committee. Very straightforward. If you don't cooperate, you are very likely to be found to be in breach on those grounds alone, let alone any of the matters that have been brought to our attention. Requesting unjustified additional fees for work that should be in scope. So we regularly see complaints about members who have demanded extra money before dealing with a matter that arguably is related to the original work that they wanted to undertake. A classic example is demanding or asking for additional fees before responding to queries raised by a building control body for design or submissions made to that building control body. It goes back to the first issue. You need to have very clear terms of engagement, and where you've agreed to offer a deliverable, it's important that you do not seek to charge excessive fees for doing that in general terms. Failure to take adequate responsibility for actions of staff under their supervision. So, accountability is key. Failure to notify CABE of matters arising listed under mandatory requirements. So, criminal offences, sanctioned by another body, insolvency or financial difficulties. And finally, mismanagement of client funds, fraud and tax evasion. These are sometimes easy matters to fall into by accident, but there are clearly obligations when it comes to anything to do with finance to act in a highly professional way. Sorry. Which kind of brings us to the end of that session. I hope it's been helpful. Ultimately, all of the code and the supporting frameworks that we have is there to incentivize and support professional behavior, to enable people to act in professional integrity. And one of the best definitions, one that comes up commonly when these matters are discussed, is in terms of defining what we mean by that, is about doing the right thing, particularly when no one else is looking. We are here to try and work with you to deliver the best outcomes for you and for the public. I'm just going to have a look to see whether we have any questions before I close the session down. So let's look in the chat. Right. So we've only got one question, after which I'll shut the session. How would you deal with someone who is a member of, say, CABE, whose competence and methodology, in your opinion, falls below accepted professional standards? In this instance, it'd be difficult to be respectful of her qualification and his professional standing. I think if you have legitimate concerns about someone's competence or approach, you should escalate that to relevant people who are part of that oversight framework in the first instance. So if it's about a colleague at work, you should be talking to their line manager. Perhaps you maybe should raise it with them first, but then if you don't see the response that you think is adequate, you might need to raise it with their line manager. Ultimately, the code of conduct does require that if you think that they are breaching the code of conduct, you report that. That happens very infrequently, but it probably should happen a bit more, which sounds terrible. No one likes the idea of kind of reporting on each other. But I do think where we see serious default, we have had a bad habit as an industry of not challenging it. And that has been very tricky indeed in terms of sustaining bad practice. It's something we'll have to get better with over time. I think the industry will progressively change. I think expectations have changed. Our job is to help ensure that all of our members have the confidence to do the right thing and get the backing when they need to do that. So thank you, Richard Flynn, for your kind comment. Always good to know. I don't see any other questions, so I think I'm going to say thank you very much for attending. Oh, hold on. Another question here. How much will CABE protect the engineer from unreasonable rogue clients? Okay, so we, I guess, have limits to what we can do. If you want to come to us for advice or support, we're here. Rogue clients are a big problem, however, and I think the best advice is probably to avoid them if you can. That's not very helpful. I respect, but when I trained as an architect, one of my tutors said, with some clients, it is better to, when they ask you to work for them, it is better to write them a check for £10,000 and walk away. So I think there is a degree of sense checking whether the client's reputation is one that should be avoided. I certainly know that there are a lot of contractors now who do more due diligence on the people that they tender for, and they do indeed walk away more frequently from those where they think there are concerns about whether they're going to act responsibly. Do we get a CPD certificate for this, and how do we retrieve? We will get in touch with you on that. I'm sure that you will. And it will normally go straight to your account if you've logged in. Okay, I'm going to shut the session there. Thank you very much for attending. I hope it's been useful, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.